A champagne countdown melted into cheers, paper hats went crooked, and a young mother lifted her face to the bright noise of a new year. Sometime after midnight, as music thinned and goodbyes turned into promises to call tomorrow, she stepped out of a bar into cool air and the hush that follows celebration. She was supposed to be home not long after. The drive would have been short. The plan was simple. By dawn, Pensacola would wake to an empty stretch of roadside, a blue towel with dark stains, and a silence that refused to explain itself. Welcome to Fractured Files, the place for careful, detail-driven storytelling. Tonight follows a New Year's Eve that never finished, a case that stalled in a single hour of night, and a name that only surfaced after 35 years of trying. The victim is Tanya McKinley. Tonya was born on January 25, 1961, in Milton, Florida, a small town at a short drive from the water. She grew up in a home where laughter had room to breathe. An older sister shared the easy things that bind siblings together: afternoons outside, skateboards clattering down sidewalks, bowling nights that smelled like rental shoes and waxed lanes. After high school, Tanya wanted a bigger circle. Pensacola sat about 25 miles away, close enough to visit family, far enough to feel like a step forward. She moved there and looked toward medicine, not the long white coat road, but a path she could enter quickly. Medical transcription offered that lane. No degree was required, only specialized courses and accuracy that rewarded attention to detail. Her cousin Vanita moved with her. They split rent, leaned on each other, and built a routine that felt like adulthood. Love threaded in, as it usually does when routines settle. Tonya met a man named Tim. They dated and eventually moved in together. In 1983, a son arrived. They named him Timothy. Motherhood fit her with a kind of fierce tenderness everyone around her noticed. The relationship with Tim had rough edges, though. Arguments cut into the weeks. A year after the baby's birth, they separated. It wasn't a clean unraveling. Tim called often, knocked on doors, tried to rebuild what she'd decided to leave. Tanya, practical and stubborn in the best ways, moved forward. Late in 1984, she stayed with Vanita again. By then, Vanita had a husband and 2 kids. The plan was straightforward: work hard, save, find a new place, stand on her own 2 feet. New Year's Eve gave her a different kind of plan. On December 31st, Tanya, Vanita, and Vanita's husband decided to celebrate at a local bar. They left the children at a late-night daycare, a service that closed at 1 a.m., and stepped into a room of noise and friendly faces. The night felt good. There was dancing and the small reunion moments that happen when a familiar bar fills up with people who've known each other for years. Midnight arrived in a tangle of confetti, hugs, and relief that another year had been lived and a fresh one had begun. Vanita and her husband needed to go. The daycare would close soon. Tanya wasn't ready to end her night. For 2 years, her life had revolved around work schedules and a toddler's needs. This was a rare pocket of time to laugh and let muscles unclench. She asked Vanita to pick up Timothy with her own kids, and Vanita agreed. Before parting, Vanita asked the obvious question: how would Tanya get home without the car they'd arrived in? Tanya said not to worry. She had friends in that room. Someone would give her a ride. The first morning of 1985 had its own quiet rhythm in most houses. For Vanita, the quiet felt wrong. She woke, checked, waited, and realized Tanya's side of the space was still untouched. It was odd. Tanya should have been back hours earlier. Vanita told herself that maybe an old friend had offered a couch. Anxiety drifted in anyway. Then a knock at the door turned uncertainty into fact. Vanita's mother-in-law stood there with news that didn't feel like it could belong to their family. Police had found a body. It was Tanya. The discovery had begun with a mother and daughter in a car and a sick dog. Around 3 a.m., they'd left home for a veterinary clinic. The daughter saw something at the edge of the road and said it looked like a mannequin. The mother pulled over, stepped into the dark, and understood how wishful that thought had been. She went back home and called the police. Officers reached an empty lot off the road and found a young woman face up in the grass. Her tights were pulled down, her dress had ridden up, her shoes were missing. Nearby lay a blue towel smeared with red that had no business being called anything but blood. Identification didn't take long. A purse recovered a few streets away held an ID card. The name matched the rumor that had started to move through the city. 23 years old, Tanya McKinley. The scene told a quick, careful story about movement. There was no pooling blood where her body lay, only the stains on the towel. Drag marks in the ground ran from the road to the place where she had been left. That suggested she died elsewhere and been relocated to that lot. On the towel and on her body, investigators collected hair. Some were head hairs, some were pubic hairs. There was also dog fur. The mixture nudged detectives toward a suspect who owned a dog or had spent time with one that night. Medical examiners documented the injuries. A heavy blow to the head had left its mark. The cause of death, though, was strangulation. Sexual assault was present. In 1985, DNA analysis, as it's known now, wasn't available to local departments in a routine way. The laboratory could say that the semen belonged to someone with type B blood. It could not yet tell them who. Detectives did what they always do. They started where statistics recommended. Ex-partners are fair questions in acts of violence. Tim, the father of Tanya's child, had argued with her before and after the breakup, disliked that she'd ended the relationship and kept showing up, making calls, pressing his case. The timeline allowed jealousy to bloom into suspicion. Could he have followed Tanya to the bar, confronted her, and escalated into murder? Investigators brought him in. He denied any involvement. He offered hair samples. The lab couldn't pull DNA from those hairs in 1985, but they could use microscopy to compare characteristics. Tim's hair didn't match what had been found on Tanya or the towel. It was a small relief attached to a larger setback. He was ruled out. The case didn't have a new primary suspect. Police widened their circle to include everyone who had been at the bar. Witnesses described a normal night for Tanya. No strange arguments, no men cornering her, no flare-ups that suggested a specific danger. The bartenders and staff went through a list of familiar patrons. One name stood out only because he crossed two categories. Kurt had tended bar that night and had also dated Tanya briefly after she'd broken up with Tim. He'd been on shift earlier, then left for another party with friends. Those friends confirmed that he showed up eventually, not immediately. That gap mattered. Tanya had last been seen alive around 1:15 a.m. A family who drove past the empty lot at 2 a.m. told officers with quiet certainty that there had been no body then. If both observations were accurate, Tanya had been killed and moved within a narrow 90-minute window. Kurt's timeline left a space inside that window. He took a polygraph. The results sat in the gray zone, inconclusive, with deceptive responses flagged on some questions. But his blood type didn't match the type indicated by the semen. If the killer was type B, Kurt wasn't the killer. He came off the board. The investigation kept breathing but struggled to expand its lungs. The semen couldn't identify a man by name. There were no eyewitnesses who could anchor a specific car or face to the stretch of night between 1:15 and 3 a.m. The dump site lay at the edge of a dense residential area on a road that didn't invite casual traffic. Detectives felt strongly that whoever left Tanya there had known the neighborhood. That belief didn't move handcuffs onto anyone. Files thickened, leads cooled, families adjusted to a new shape of life. Timothy was 18 months old when Tanya died. He grew up inside a protective fiction built by people who loved him. They told him his mother had died in a car accident. When he turned 14 and winter approached, curiosity looped him toward a closet where gifts might be hidden. He didn't find wrapping paper or a surprise. He found a letter. It was addressed to Montel Williams, a television host whose show often featured missing persons and cold cases. The letter asked for help mentioning Tonya's unsolved murder, the hope being that national attention might pull up a lead. Timothy read his mother's real story in his father's words. That was how he learned what had actually happened. In the early 2000s, the case was reopened. Time had given the evidence a second chance. Laboratories could do more with less. Technicians went back to the blue towel and the other items that had been sealed and preserved. The blood on that towel wasn't Tonya's. It belonged to an unknown man. This time, the lab produced a DNA profile. It went into the FBI's database. No match came back. Detectives took samples from men who had drawn suspicion over the years and compared them against the profile. All were negative. The file returned to its shelf with one powerful asset and no way to exploit it. The killer's genetic fingerprint existed, but the name that went with it didn't. On the 30th anniversary in 2015, the case opened again. Investigators tried a fresh approach. If the killer's DNA wasn't in the database, perhaps a relative's was. Partial matches can point to families, and then to specific people when paired with age, geography, and common sense. Analysts found one weakly similar profile inside the federal system. They built a tree and knocked on doors. Family members agreed to provide new samples. The comparisons produced a clean answer. The family had no connection to the suspect profile. The team was back to nothing. In 2018, attention came from an angle no one had expected. A journalist named Tony Adam took an interest in the case. He didn't specialize in crime. Curiosity, and something more human than curiosity, pushed him toward a story that had haunted his community for decades. He reached out to detectives. He asked to help. The skepticism he met at first was as practical as it was understandable. Reporters and investigators don't always want the same things. Still, progress had stalled. An extra pair of hands couldn't hurt. Tony brought energy, organization, and a willingness to show up and keep showing up. He talked to Tanya's family and built trust. He worked to get the case back into the news, the kind of coverage that might shake loose memory in people who'd been near the bar or the lot in 1985. His presence didn't replace police work. It amplified it. By 2019, detectives were ready to try a different tool in a different arena. They contacted Parabone, a company known for applying genetic genealogy to cold cases. Earlier attempts had searched only the FBI's database, which holds the DNA of arrestees and convicted offenders. Parabon tapped into public genealogy databases used by people looking for relatives or mapping ancestry. The data pool was larger. The method was painstaking. Analysts looked for clusters of shared DNA that suggested distant cousins, then built family trees backward and forward until they could isolate candidates who fit the basic facts. The man they needed would have been old enough to commit the crime in 1985 and connected geographically to the route between the bar and the lot. The work took nearly a year. In February 2020, the net tightened around a name: Daniel Wells. He was 57 in 2020, which put him in his early 20s in 1985. He had lived in the Pensacola area at the time of the murder. In the late 80s, he'd been arrested for assault and later for indecent exposure. At the moment detectives looked at him, he lived in Pensacola with a wife and children and worked as a carpenter. To move from suspicion to an arrest, they needed to compare his DNA to the profile recovered from the towel. Parabon's tree had provided direction, not proof. Surveillance began quietly. When investigators watch someone they believe may be a killer, The goal is to collect what they need without spooking the subject into leaving town. Daniel made it easier than they expected. One afternoon, near his workplace, he flicked a cigarette butt out his car window. Officers retrieved it within minutes. The lab pulled DNA from saliva on the filter and ran the comparison. The result locked into place. It matched the profile from Tanya's case. 35 years after a young mother danced on New Year's Eve, the state had a name for the biological trace left at the edge of the road. The arrest needed to be handled with care. Detectives wanted a confession as well as science. They asked uniformed officers to make a routine traffic stop. They approached Daniel and told him he needed to come to the station. Once he sat in an interview room, they didn't immediately drop their strongest card. They asked about his life in 1985. They turned the conversation to the bar where Tonya had been last seen. He denied knowing her. He denied being there. Then they told him his DNA had been found at the scene. He stuck to his denial and grew more anxious. They reminded him that DNA wasn't a rumor to argue with. It was a result. They told him the only path left to him that might matter was honesty. Eventually, Daniel began to talk. The version he gave was a familiar construction for men in his position. He said he'd been at the bar and met Tonya there. According to him, she was looking for a ride. He offered. They went to his house. They drank. He said they had consensual sex. He said an argument started and escalated. He claimed he couldn't remember what set it off. He remembered grabbing a heavy wooden cutting board and striking her. He said he panicked, believed she died from the blow, dragged her to his car, drove to the lot, and left her there. He said he threw her belongings out the window on the drive back. When asked about animal fur found on the towel and her clothing, he said his roommate owned a black Labrador, and yes, the dog's hair would have been black. It was a tidy, self-serving explanation with holes that didn't need very deep digging to find. The medical findings contradicted the heart of his story. Tanya's cause of death wasn't blunt force trauma. It was strangulation. The details suggested a more likely sequence. He took her from the bar with the promise of a ride. He tried to force sex. She resisted. He hit her with the cutting board. When he realized she was still alive, he strangled her. Detectives didn't need to argue the narrative in the room right then. They needed the admission that placed him with Tonya and accounted for the DNA. They had it. Daniel Wells was booked for murder. Investigators called Tanya's family. They told Timothy that his mother's killer had finally been identified. He cried, thanked them, and tried to understand how relief and grief can live in the same breath. The announcement didn't lead to a trial. 2 weeks after his arrest, Daniel was found dead in his jail cell. The medical finding was suicide. A courtroom would never hear opening statements. A jury would never deliberate. Tanya's family saw accountability replaced by an ending that cut away years, but didn't add closure in the way many imagine it. What they had was a name, a match, a confession, and the knowledge that he would never harm anyone again. Looking back across the decades, a few details stand up straight against the blur of time. The blue towel near the body held a man's blood, a patient clue that had to wait for technology to mature. The dump site sat where someone local would have known to turn in without drawing attention. The dog fur on the towel and clothing lined up later with a roommate's black lab. The first circles of investigation made sense statistically and still missed the right target, a reminder that likelihood and truth don't always overlap. What did help was evidence that was bagged and labeled properly in the first week of 1985, then protected by people who understood that preservation is its own kind of search. Public attention had its role too. A journalist's persistence kept a case in the middle of the table when it could have slid to the side. Genetic genealogy brought the map that law enforcement couldn't draw alone. There's also the life that began where the case began, but kept going. Timothy grew up under a story meant to protect him. He kept going anyway, built his own life with the knowledge that the worst thing that ever happened to him and his mother had been moved into a file and labeled cold. 35 years is a long time to wait for an answer. It's not long enough to dull what happened. Answers rarely do that. They draw a circle around what's true so that memory doesn't have to keep searching in every direction. This is Fractured Files. If this deep dive mattered to you, like the video, subscribe to the channel and share it so more people can hear these stories told with patience and care. New investigations are coming soon. Stay safe and stay watchful.